Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture, including the world of television. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight we're joined by former journalist Todd S. Purdum, the author of a new and delightful biography of a titan of early television, Mr. Desi Arnaz. The book's title, Desi Arnaz, The Man Who Invented Television. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you so much for having me. A delight to be here, Steve.
This is such an interesting topic for me. As I was telling you before our show began, I kind of feel like I grew up with I Love Lucy. I was born on September 9th, 1951, which is the day after production began on the show. So there was kind of a connection there. And then in our house, early television, I think it's one of the earliest shows I remember watching. Now, I arrived in LA, I was four, and then starting in the mid 50s, I started watching a lot of cartoons, as you do when you're six, seven, and eight. But I would wander into the living room occasionally, and there we would see I Love Lucy. So this is such a big topic, and we're of course focusing on Desi. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about you seem to be fascinated about pop culture. You've done books on the theater. You come from a terrific journalism background. What got you interested in show business?
Well, I certainly grew up with I Love Lucy too in syndication, 15 years after its premiere, but it was ubiquitous on television in the 1960s when I was growing up. If you were homesick from school, I Love Lucy was the treat that you got to watch in the morning, on the CBS affiliate where it was being rerun. I always have loved show business. My parents, I grew up in a small town in Illinois. They would go visit my father's brother, who was an actor in New York. They'd spend a week there and come home with 8 playbills, having seen 8 shows in 7 days. And so I grew up on the original cast albums of those Broadway musicals of the '60s. And then I went off to work at the New York Times out of college, and I mostly became a political reporter. But I always kept my hand in pop culture when I could. For a while, I was the Los Angeles bureau chief of the New York Times, which was a great job. And whenever I had the chance, I wrote about movies or television. So it's always been an itch that I wanted to scratch. And now that I'm older and my journalism career is sort of behind me, it's been a great excuse to delve into these topics that have always interested me.
By the way, the name Purdum is interesting for me because there was a marvelous actor named Edmund Purdum. Any relation?
No, he was no relation. He spelled his name slightly differently, actually, with a OM at the end. Ours is UM. It's really just that somebody probably left the loop of the U open or the O closed. The name is French in origin, Prud'homme, like the New Orleans chef Paul Prud'homme. And when somebody crossed the channel, it probably got anglicized a little bit. But my uncle, whose name was Ralph Purdum, was active in New York on the theater at the same time that Edmund Purdum was active in the movies. His name was often misspelled, in publicity and playbills and things like that because of Edmund Purdum.
Edmund Purdum replaced Marlon Brando in the cast of The Egyptian in 1955 or 1954. And the story goes that Marlon Brando attended a reading with Daryl Zanuck's mistress, Bella Darvey, who was playing the Temptress in that movie. That was a big epic movie for the studio. And
Oh,
after sitting with Bella Darvey for a few minutes, Marlon Brando left and never came back. And he probably knew something that other people hadn't known yet. Tell me, I mean, everybody who is interested in show business history, you've got to pick up Todd's book because it's not only a marvelous biography of Desi and Lucy as well, but it's an interesting portrait of Hollywood at the time as television was emerging as a major competition to the studios. It's ironic, here it is 2025, 75 years later, and the studios are facing the competition from streaming. So of course nothing's changed.
no, there's always a new kid on the block. I mean, first the movies faced sound and radio and television, and then in the 70s and 80s, the movies were frantically nervous about the advent of the video cassette recorder. They didn't realize what a boon that was ultimately going to be for them in terms of a whole nother tranche of sales possibilities. So yes, it's ever thus. But one of the things that I had such an interesting time exploring in this book is how Desi and Lucy were really taking a chance on television in 1951. It was a distinctly second tier medium. It was looked down on by the Hollywood elite. They were risking their careers in a way by doing this show. And of course, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
Well, it's interesting. I knew very little about Desi. In fact, I think I learned in your first chapter that the name Arnaz is actually an anglicized version of a Spanish pronunciation. Did I get it correct? That is,
Yeah, I think the Desi Arnaz Jr. tells me it's originally a Basque name from the border between France and Spain. Desi's relatives emigrated, his ancestors emigrated from Spain to Cuba in the 19th century. He was born and raised in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest city on the island, where his father was the mayor. His mother's father was an executive at the Bacardi rum company, and he really grew up as a prince with kind of every conceivable material advantage. And then the family lost everything in the 1933 Cuban Revolution and fled to Florida with basically nothing in their pockets. And Desi reinvented himself.
well, he certainly was blessed with good looks. And in finding one of these portraits of him early on, he was pretty much a hunk's hunk at that time.
Yes, no, definitely. He made a big sensation first as a self-taught musician in Miami. He was ultimately spotted by Xavier Cugat, the band leader who was known as the King of the Rumba, who took him to his orchestra at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Then he got his own nightclub act at a club in Miami, where he was spotted by Lorenz Hart of the Rodgers and Hart Broadway songwriting team, and they cast him in their musical Too Many Girls in 1939, which was a show about college football. And when the movie was made the next year in 1940, Desi came to Hollywood, and he met a contract player, an actress at RKO Studios who'd already made 60 movies, and her name was Lucille Ball, and they fell head over heels in love and eloped within 6 months.
I find it amazing that Lucy, when she meets Desi, had such a prolific career, but really a lot of them were B movies, weren't they?
Yes, she was a steadily working actress her whole time in Hollywood, but she never quite broke through to the front rank of stars. She had some very good movies. She made a wonderful movie with Henry Fonda called The Big Street. She was in a lot of musical spectaculars at MGM in the mid 40s with stars like Van Johnson, but she never really made it to the top in movies. And it was television that made her into the worldwide star that she became.
Interestingly, a lot of the early film work wasn't necessarily comedy, so she couldn't show off her ability as a comic performer. True?
True. She was cast when she came to Hollywood as a chorus girl, even though she couldn't really sing or dance. Then she became a kind of glamour puss. She was in a lot of movies where she was a sophisticated showgirl type of person, or in dramas where she was her whole life beautiful, which was rare for a comedian. But it wasn't until the late 1940s at MGM where she came under the mentorship of, among other people, the veteran silent comedian Buster Keaton and a couple of directors who had worked in silent movies and saw in Lucy an enormous skill at particularly physical comedy. Everyone who knew her said she wasn't verbal, she wasn't funny in real life, she wasn't a joke teller. She'd get tangled up and lose the punchline. But when she started dealing with props or taking pratfalls or doing basically silent comedy with the incredible expressive face that she had, that's when she really soared. And so those talents were really kind of first nurtured in the late 1940s. And then she got a radio sitcom in the last days of network radio called My Favorite Husband for CBS. And that's where the persona that became Lucy Ricardo really began to emerge.
So My Favorite Husband on radio was kind of the precursor of I Love Lucy.
Definitely, definitely. With the same producer and writers, Jess Oppenheimer, Madeline Pugh, Bob Carroll Jr. And the scenario was a kind of wacky, frustrated wife of a fifth vice president of a bank who's always scheming and dreaming to get out of her apron strings and into the wider world. And that was the same dynamic that was at play with Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. He was a band leader in show business, and all he wanted to do was come home to a happy housewife who'd make him comfortable home and children. And Lucy, Ricardo, was always scheming to get into the show, to get into the act, to break out of her stereotypical role as a cook and bottle washer and have more adventure. And at some level, that was the basic pattern that got established first on the radio, that then carried over to television.
Um, so Lucy's having her own challenges building her film career, heading her way towards television. Desi was a victim of a lot of prejudice at that time. Latino performers were not exactly being welcomed into Hollywood.
Yes, no. If they were being welcomed, they were being welcomed into a very narrow niche of kind of, musical comedies, promoting uh, Pan-American harmony in the middle of World War II when we wanted to make sure that we had allies in the Western Hemisphere, and the sort of good Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy of friendship toward Latin America and Mexico. But Desi wasn't a classic Latin lover type. He was really more like an all-purpose. He said he wanted to be the Cuban Mickey Rooney, who was, of course, at that time the number one box office star in the world for MGM, and was a triple threat, musician, comedian, could do drama as well. Desi never, just as Lucy never really quite found her footing and made it into the big time in the movies. Desi never did either. He had a successful band, which kept him on the road a lot of the time and kept them separated. And that was part of the impetus for wanting to make I Love Lucy together in Hollywood.
So it sounds like they were totally beneficial of timing.
Absolutely.
Tell our audience essentially how they found themselves making a sitcom.
Well, they were in the right place at the right time. Television was just becoming incredibly popular, so CBS wanted to transfer My Favorite Husband from radio to television. And Lucy only wanted to do that if Desi could be the co-star, but he knew that he could not persuasively play the WASP American fifth vice president of a bank, so they had to come up with another concept. And CBS was not enthusiastic about the idea of this mixed marriage of the thick accented Latin guy married to the all American girl. So Desi, in order to persuade CBS and reluctant sponsors that the public would accept them, came up with the idea of going on a vaudeville tour around the country to big movie houses where they would do a live stage show before the feature. And Lucy would do comedy, he'd sing and dance and play his drum and lead his orchestra. And it turns out they got rave reviews in cities all over the country. And that ultimately persuaded CBS to take a chance on them with the show. The challenge then was at that time, television was really centered in New York. It was almost completely a live medium. There was no coaxial cable yet, and a television signal couldn't be beamed live across the whole country. So CBS wanted them to come and do the show in New York. And they were shocked. They said, no, the whole idea is we want to do it here in Los Angeles. And CBS said, well, the only way you could do that is if you film it, and that will cost more. Whereupon Desi said, okay, we'll take the pay cut, but then I want to own the negatives. I want to own the film. And since nobody yet envisioned what a vibrant aftermarket there could be for television programs, CBS said yes, and it became the foundation of what became an empire for Lucy and Desi that ultimately made them the largest producer of television content in the world by the end of the 1950s.
I spent a lot of time working on my encyclopedia of the Twilight Zone, which allowed me to watch all the episodes. And in the second season, the head of CBS at that time, James Aubrey, wanted them to save money to make shows on videotape. And the shows were so the quality compared to the sharp film related shows was so sharp. And I after going through that experience and you telling me in the book that they wanted to put I Love Lucy on the film, which was not an accepted method of filming, was interesting.
No, it was not a standard practice at all. Television, as I said, was pretty much a live medium, except, and the videotape hadn't been invented yet. So the only way to record a television program was to shoot a 16 millimeter film off of a video monitor, which produced something called a kinescope, which was a very blurry, unsubtle, not a very good picture at all. And in the case of a show that was produced in New York, to be seen on the West Coast, that would have to be shipped across the country and seen as much as a week later. So there wasn't really what we experience now, coast to coast live broadcasting of the same thing at the same time in every market. Um, And it was Desi's genius to realize that if they preserved the show on pristine black and white 35 millimeter film stock, they would be making a little movie every week, and it would have incredible durability, which is why we see it today.
Did I read properly that shortly after production began, there was a technical innovation?
Yes, and that's the twist. They came up with this whole thing in the summer of 1951, and in the fall of 1951, just before I Love Lucy went on the air, AT&T did complete its coast-to-coast link up using cable and a microwave link, so that President Truman broadcast a nationwide broadcast from San Francisco that went across country for the first time. So the paradox is, or the twist, that the whole method that I Love Lucy had devised wouldn't actually have been necessary because the shows could have been broadcast live. But then they, in all likelihood, if they had been recorded at all, would have been preserved only on a blurry kinescope, and we wouldn't see them with anything like the fidelity that we see them today, and they wouldn't have had the afterlife that they have. And the reason they do is because they look so great. They have such high visual quality that they look as fresh as the day they were made. And there are no topical references. Nobody would know the Korean War was going on, or Harry Truman was president, or then Dwight Eisenhower. They exist out of time and space, almost like Greek comedy in a kind of eternal comment on the human condition.
Well, after seeing those crummy Twilight Zone episodes on videotape, I'm so glad they filmed on film. So they get the show moving. They've got to do their casting. Obviously, two of the key characters they have to hire a Fred and an Ethel, and they get William Frawley and Vivian Vance, who are not necessarily the first choices, I guess.
No, they had wanted originally to have Lucy's radio show had Gail Gordon, who later became her co-star in the second and third Lucy series that she did, and Bea Benaderet, who later became best known as the voice of Betty Rubble and also Aunt Kate on the Petticoat Junction TV series. She was also on the Burns and Allen show. But though they were occupied still, so they weren't free. And it turns out that then they got William Frawley, a beloved character actor who'd been in a whole bunch of movies. He'd been in vaudeville. He'd done about everything there was to do in show business. And then Desi and Jess Oppenheimer went down to see Vivian Vance in a play, and she'd been a Broadway veteran who had not really done much in the movies and had never done television and wasn't really interested in it. And they struck gold with both of them because, of course, they were the perfect neighbors and backups for the Ricardos, and were a huge part of the success and the kind of emotional heft of the show.
Um, it's I love how do I explain this? I Love Lucy. It's like a well-worn shoe. You put it on every week, and of course, Fred and Ethel, William Frawley and Vivian Vance were so much a part of that, and they all worked together so beautifully. Were there any fireworks? I know that Frawley had a tendency to take a drink occasionally.
Yeah, the only real fireworks were that Frawley and Vivian Vance just did not get along personally. She resented having to play the wife of a person who was much older and grumpy and frumpy. He didn't think she was as talented as he was. He was an old trooper who had helped, popularize old songs like Melancholy Baby and Carolina in the Morning. Vivian had understudied Ethel Merman on Broadway and Anything Goes in the original production. But they had what we might call in New York a minimum high regard for each other. And in a way, that wasn't the worst thing because it probably carried over into the dynamic of the characters, which were also always a little bit at odds. And that probably the off-screen tension probably showed up in a kind of amusing on-screen chemistry as well. But that was really the only source of significant tension on the show was those two just didn't get along in real life.
Well, of course, there was the rather turbulent and tempestuous relationship between Lucy and Desi.
Yes.
Desi, and you documented beautifully in your book. Desi considered himself a very much a typical Latin gentleman who had no problems straying from the marital nest. And of course, Lucy was outraged by all this, but this seemed to be a continuing problem almost from the first time they got married.
Yes, almost from the very beginning. Desi had been raised in the Latin culture of Cuba. His father and grandfather both had mistresses when he was growing up. He had operated on the principle that, your wife was your wife and you loved her, and sexual dalliances that you had on the side meant nothing to you, so they shouldn't mean anything to her. And Lucy tolerated that for a while, but she never really bought into it. She was an old-fashioned American, woman, a middle-class upbringing, and kind of in a stable family in Jamestown, New York, and she put up with that when it was quiet and out of the public eye. The problem was as their marriage went on and as the show became successful and they became the subject of enormous press attention, Desi's philandering, particularly his patronage of prostitutes, became more and more public. And ultimately, he was arrested for weaving down a street in Hollywood where there was a bunch of notorious bordellos. He was drunk and calling out for his friend J. Edgar Hoover. And this became, front page news. And Lucy just couldn't really tolerate that anymore.
It's so interesting when you make a point that Confidential magazine broke a story. I guess Confidential was the National Enquirer of its day.
Yes, but even worse, it was really skanky bottom feeder. It tried to expose people who were gay. It exposed people who had leftist political affiliations in their past, and it exposed adultery and sexual peccadillos in Hollywood. And there was a story that featured Desi, and it was humiliating for Lucy to have this happen. And it took its toll on her over time. It became increasingly wearing on their marriage. And the other thing that accompanied this was as he got more and more successful, the company got bigger, the stakes got higher. He retreated to anesthetization with alcohol and was drinking vodka with tomato soup at 11 o'clock in the morning, and ultimately kind of being unable to function as the CEO of the company.
Well, as they're drawing apart in one way, they definitely still wanted to have children, and of course, they had Lucy first, and then Desi Jr.'s birth coincides almost with the beginning of the show. And I found it interesting that the whole concept that the networks didn't necessarily want a pregnant woman on television. It was considered very, very gauche at the time. How did they get past that?
Yes, the show debuted in the fall of 1951 when their daughter Lucy was an infant. And by the following springtime, Lucy realized she was pregnant again. And this loomed as a potential crisis because there'd never been a pregnant woman on the air. And if she had not been able to film the series that fall of 1952, they would have probably had to take the show off the air. So Jess Oppenheimer and Desi together came up with the conviction that they could do a whole series of tasteful, amusing shows about what it's like to have a baby. But CBS and Philip Morris were not buying that. Ultimately, Desi had to go over the heads of the network to the chairman of Philip Morris, the cigarette maker that was the sponsor of the show, and say, look, we've given you the number one show on television. And if you don't want us to be in charge of it anymore, then you're going to have to be in charge of it. And we can't be responsible for the ratings anymore. Whereupon the executive sent a memo to his team saying in a very pungent language I'm not going to use on your podcast, don't mess around with the Cuban. And so they hired a three-part panel, a Catholic priest, a rabbi, and a Protestant minister to vet all the scripts, to advise them on how they could do this. But you couldn't even say the word pregnant on the air. So Desi Arnaz years later recalled that it turned out to be funnier anyway for him to say that Lucy was going to be Spectin in his Spanish accent, and he got a better laugh with Spectin than he ever could have with pregnant.
Well, of course, this is the era where couples are not allowed to sleep in the same bed.
No, the married couples on television were in twin beds, and part of the issue was, if you had a baby, it meant you'd have sex, and that was a topic that just wasn't really discussed on television in the 1950s.
And of course, this is at the same time that gunfighters and 90 jillion Westerns are shooting each other on the streets. Violence is fine.
Violence is okay. Sex was not.
Well, the reruns, of course, have been on literally forever. And I guess one of the shows, I'm not sure which season, it might have been one of the first two seasons, is of course the show where Ethel and Lucy have to they go on an assembly line. I guess with their well, there's it's in a little
The
chocolate
chocolate factory, yeah, they're
chocolate
trying to
factory.
pack the chocolates. First, they're trying to roll the chocolates, and then they're trying to pack the chocolates. But yes, they bet the boys, they bet Fred and Ricky that they could do okay out in the world of work, and that Fred and Ricky would never be able to handle the housework at home. And so the episode's called Job Switching. and the girls go to this chocolate factory. It's one of the most famous scenes in the whole series where they're desperately trying to handle the chocolates moving faster and faster down the bell.
This sounds like an area where Buster Keaton probably gave her a lot of that.
Absolutely. It's such a strongly visual moment. And Lucy's doing all kinds of things, stuffing them down her top in her chef's hat you see there, ultimately cramming them into her mouth. And you wouldn't have had to have any sound at all. It's all in effectively in pantomime as you watch their desperate effort to keep up with the assembly line.
Now, the other shows, and I remember staying home from being sick from school, and I would watch these episodes. I love the Hollywood episodes. Oh my goodness. To see my favorite stars suddenly appearing on the I Love Lucy was just so crazy. And of course, one of the shows was where John Wayne shows up. Tell the audience what this basic episode was about.
Well, the whole Hollywood series is that Lucy gets into all kinds of misadventures because she's trying to meet movie stars, and they go to Grauman's Chinese Theater and they're looking at John Wayne's signature in the concrete, and they come up with the idea. I can't remember exactly. Did they? I think they try to steal it, but in moving it out, they break it, and it involves having to re-pour it, and then they get stuck in the concrete. And of course, ultimately, John Wayne is very sweet and forgiving, and everything ends happily. But it's a chaotic scene where they're trying to secretly fix his footprints at Grauman's, and they bring buckets of concrete at nighttime, and it's a classic misadventure.
Classic chaotic. And every one of them, I remember the Richard Widmark episode, Rock Hudson. And this was Desi being very savvy about bringing guest stars to the show. That was kind of common with the other shows these days, or was that something?
I don't know that it was so common. I mean, occasionally there would be cross promotion, like one star would go on it, but this was still in the 1950s when movie stars, generally speaking, many of them just simply didn't do television at all. They were reluctant to do television. So the deal they made with people like William Holden and John Wayne was that if they came on I Love Lucy, the script would involve some mention of whatever the current movie project they were doing was, so they could promote that as a part of their appearance. They'd get paid, I think, usually union scale, but they would then have valuable publicity for their movie because I Love Lucy at 9 o'clock Eastern on Monday nights was the number one rated show on the air. So it had a huge audience. Routinely 30, 40 million people a week were watching I Love Lucy when the country was like 160 million people.
Yeah, compare that to today, where a top show might get 7 million people, if that.
Exactly. 7, 8, 9, 10 million people, like something like NCIS or 60 Minutes. Football or the Super Bowl obviously gets bigger audiences, but nothing like, and then now we're in a country of, more than 300 million people. So you can see just what a dominant place I Love Lucy had in the culture, not just, the popular culture, but the whole national culture. It was a nationwide phenomenon.
Now, Desilu, which is the company they formed, because of the success of I Love Lucy, starts to branch out. And they actually were the producers of the Eve Arden series, Our Miss Brooks.
Yep.
And then I think they backed the Spring Byington series, December Bride.
Yes. Yes.
How successful were these first
Those
probes?
other series were serious successes. They were very solid. They didn't come to the level of I Love Lucy's spectacular success, but they did well. They had a less luck during the 1950s with a series of other short-lived programs that never quite got the same amount of traction. But then they became a landlord for other shows that were successful, like Danny Thomas, Dick Van Dyke, Andy Griffith, and so on. And they rented studio space and facilities and production and editing facilities to those shows, and that became a source of revenue for them. And then when you mentioned the Twilight Zone, ultimately at the end of 1957, they stopped the weekly I Love Lucy's and began a series of hour-long specials that would be interspersed with other programming. And then eventually Desi created an hour-long anthology series called the Desilu Playhouse, which would have hour-long dramas on television. And one of those was a film by Rod Serling, the Twilight Zone creator, called The Time Element, and that became what amounted to the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone. And then similarly, in 1959, Desi came up with another show for the Playhouse based on the memoirs of the Prohibition G-man Elliot Ness, The Untouchables, which was about organized crime in the Depression and bootlegging and so on. And that became a hugely successful series for ABC starring Robert Stack. That was really the last great hit show that Desilu had.
I remember both those shows vividly. The time element I didn't know too much about. Was Desilu Playhouse also called Westinghouse Playhouse?
Yes, it was called the Westinghouse Desilu. Desilu. First it was called the Desilu Playhouse. Then when Westinghouse became the principal sponsor, it became called the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. And that was
And Desi actually comes out and before the show begins
and
and
introduces.
introduces the show, doing what Rod Serling would later do on his show. And for those of you who have never heard of the time element, uh, it's a terrific 1 hour. William Bendix plays a New York bartender who goes to sleep every night, and he suddenly is dreaming he's at Pearl Harbor the day before the attack, and he can't convince anybody that there's going to be this horrible attack the next day. Every day he wakes up and then he goes back to sleep, and it's actually a fascinating moment. Very pure Rod
Oh,
Serling.
it's a wonderful kind of, yeah.
Yeah, in
It,
fact,
it has all the, it has many of the sort of supernatural, hard to explain, do elements that, became part of the Twilight Zone.
what was the final straw between Desi and Lucy, Todd? What finally broke up their marriage?
Well, they started the show in an attempt to save their marriage so they could work together and be together and have a family. And I think two things happened. One, ultimately, the stresses of working together 24/7 and living together 24/7 took their toll. Lucy was a perfectionist. The only joy she seemed to get was from really hard work. Desi liked to relax. He liked to take time off. He liked to go on his boat. He'd go fishing. So I think that became an increasing source of tension. And also, as Desi was running the company and had responsibilities for the other shows, his drinking just got out of control, and with it, his philandering and womanizing also. And I think it just became too humiliating for Lucy. And as she later said, the children had seen too much. They'd seen too much of their fighting. It was time to make a break. And the nation was very upset in 1960 when they got divorced, right as the series ended. But they had what I think you'd have to call a very successful divorce. A lot of the tension went out of the relationship. They were able to recall the good times they'd had, the love they shared. They took, care of their children together. And Lucy continued to rely for the rest of her life on Desi for business and personal advice. And they stayed in close touch, and I think they never stopped loving each other. They just couldn't be together.
We should mention one of the incidents that took place early in the run of I Love Lucy. This was, of course, corresponding with the time of the blacklist and the HUAC hearings in California. They actually, someone accused Lucille Ball of being a communist.
What happened was her father died before she was 3 years old, and the father figure in her life was actually her maternal grandfather, who was an old line socialist in the Depression, and he got his whole family when they moved to Hollywood to be with Lucy as a young actress to register on the Communist Party line in 1933. And years later, during the Red Scare of the 1950s, somebody found this old voter registration card. The House Un-American Activities Committee called Lucy in privately. She apparently satisfied them that this is what had happened, but then it got leaked to the press. It became a story, and for 72 hours or so, it wasn't clear whether Lucy could survive it, because this was the era when anyone who'd been associated with communism in the movies or television was the subject of a blacklist and basically banned from the airways or the movies. And Lucy, they enlisted J. Edgar Hoover and the congressman on the committee to basically clear Lucy and say that this was all a misunderstanding from long ago. She'd never actually voted communist, but it was a traumatic experience for both of them that, frankly, Desi handled with enormous skill and publicity savvy, and they survived it. But it could have ended the show and ended their careers.
I think you mentioned in the book that he had a connection to J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes, they had become friends because J. Edgar Hoover every year would come to the Del Mar racetrack down in San Diego. The Arnazes would spend time at the beach at Del Mar. I think Desi might have actually even known Hoover earlier in his New York days, nightclub days. But they had a, and Desi was politically conservative for most of his life, but they did have a personal relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, who I got Desi's FBI file. His daughter had filed a Freedom of Information request years ago, and it's full of correspondence between J. Edgar Hoover and Lucy and Desi over the years. And so they had a powerful ally in him. And if he had not been on their side, and if conservative columnists like Hedda Hopper in Hollywood had not been on their side, the story might have turned out very differently.
Once they get divorced, can you talk a little bit about Desi's post career in terms of obviously the drinking was affecting him. Did he make a comeback? Was he creatively involved in some successful shows beyond Lucy? Obviously, you mentioned The Untouchables
Yeah.
and The Playhouse. Were there other shows he was involved with?
After their divorce in 1960, and after Lucy bought him out of the company in 1962, he never really had. He had one more successful series in the late 60s called The Mothers-in-Law with Eve Arden and Kay Ballard, a sitcom. He had attempts at some other series that never made it to air, but he was basically so undermined and weakened by drink that he never could quite get it together again. In the mid 1970s, he wrote his memoir. He went on the first season of Saturday Night Live to promote it, playing the conga drum in a violent dance at the end of the show. Al Franken told me that the show went a little short that night, and they had to have Desi keep dancing and pounding his drum to fill out the time. And he was doing this so vigorously, so intensely, they were afraid he might have a heart attack because he was no longer young and wasn't in great health. Anyway, ultimately, he never really had a hit again. And finally, in the last year of his life, before he died, he did get sober, but then he got lung cancer and he died in 1986 when he was only 69 years old.
Did he remarry?
He remarried to a woman he'd known from the beach down in San Diego. She was married to a wealthy pet food mogul, and they had a pretty happy marriage as these things go. But he was also unfaithful to her, and that caused tension. She left him for a while, and then she herself died of cancer, and he outlived her and was alone. Although he had, to the end of his life, the responsibility for the care of his mother, who actually outlived him by a couple of years, well into her 90s, and that was a burden on him too, to have had that lifelong. His parents got divorced when he was still in his 20s, and his mother became his responsibility for the rest of her life, just as Lucy's mother was her responsibility as well, Lucy's widowed mother.
As we look at Desi's contribution to television, it seems like certainly your book will create more of a respect for what he did, because obviously, in the early days of television, he was truly a pioneer.
He really was. He was willing to take a risk on this untested medium. Then he devised methods of television production that were novel at the time. He worked with a large, team of other people, and he hired some of the crucial experts. And that then became the standard way of making, particularly of making sitcoms. And because it was so successful, it had spawned a lot of imitators. And it ultimately led to the transfer of the center of television production from New York to Los Angeles, where it remains to this day.
Yeah, it was the end of the live TV era. I remember again doing my Twilight Zone research that everything was moving west, and that one of James Aubrey's first jobs as he took the helm of CBS was to cancel Playhouse 90, which I guess was one of the most successful in terms of awards of shows ever.
Yeah.
And but it was a time when film was key, and obviously Rod Serling believed that, Desi believed that. Interesting times. Tell me, what you did some marvelous research on this. Are you working on a new project moving forward?
I'm hoping to do another television topic. I'm hoping that my next project might be a biography of Norman Lear, and
Oh,
the creator of All in the Family, who in some ways did for television in the 1970s in terms of innovation what Desi had done in the 1950s. And in Norman's case, the breakthrough was on the topics and the serious issues that his shows grappled with, All in the Family, Maude, The Jeffersons, Good Times, and so on. But it should be said that those Norman Lear shows use the same three camera live studio audience technique of filming that Desi had pioneered. So in a way, Norman is an heir to the Desilu innovations, and I think in a way it might make a kind of almost next chapter of the television story if it works out. I'm hoping that will be my next project.
Did you ever get a chance to meet Norman?
Yes, I did. I knew him a little bit over the years. I'd interviewed him a couple times when I was working at the New York Times. I shared a couple of dinners with him and his family. So I do have some personal memory and recollection. And of course, since I spent most of my life as a political reporter, Norman's whole sort of third career, if you will, as a political and civic activist with People for the American Way and supporting liberal causes and democracy was a very important part of his life too. He died at 101 and a half, so he had a very long, rich, full life, and I think it will make it should make an interesting subject.
I went to they do them occasionally. Ithaca College does a tribute to a Hollywood person. I guess someone gets the Rod Serling Award, and they gave it to Norman one year I was there and got to meet him. What a wonderful man.
Yes, remarkable guy.
Um, well, we have been having a fascinating discussion. I can't say enough about the book. Tell them where they can find it, please.
At your favorite local independent bookstore, and of course, all online retailers as well. But you know, as an author and a reader, I have to urge you to support your local bookseller because we depend on those in communities all across the country, and they need your business.
The title of the book is Desi Arnaz, the man who invented television. Seems very true statement. Todd, this has been fabulous. You've been listening to and watching Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. Please, if you get a chance, give us a positive remark. We always appreciate the positiveness. And also tune into our other podcast, Tales from Hollywoodland, which is always fun as well. Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. Really appreciate it.